Hello everyone, welcome back again to this online structural geology NPTEL course, and we are learning deformation mechanism in this week, and today we are in our lecture number 15 part 3, and we will learn intracrystalline deformation. Before this lecture, at the very beginning of this week, we learned crystal defects. Then we learned cataclastic deformation, and today, particularly in this lecture, we will be using the concepts that we have learned from our first lecture of crystal defects. So, in this lecture, we will mostly cover intracrystalline plasticity, as I told a few seconds before. What we are going to do with this subject, we will very briefly go into this topic and introduce the different processes which are involved in this, and then we will slowly see the different governing laws for particularly dislocation glide and dislocation climb mechanisms. We learnt about these two terms in the first lecture, and finally we will conclude this lecture with dynamic recrystallization, and in the next lecture we will learn about diffusion creep or diffusive mass transfer. So, here are some basics of intracrystalline plasticity. Unlike cataclastic deformation, in the domain or in the mechanism of intracrystalline plasticity, the deformation generally nucleates and then accentuates from the crystal or lattice defects. So, we learnt about what are these crystal and lattice defects, and we will see how they help us to understand better the intracrystalline plasticity. Now, because this is mostly governed by crystal defects, so it occurs at higher depth, that means where the temperature is high, and because it is at higher depth, so volume remains constant during deformation, and therefore, it is pressure insensitive deformation, but essentially it is highly temperature sensitive mechanism, and we will see how temperature greatly influences this process. We develop a very characteristic microstructure when we see the rocks undergoing deformation through intercrystalline plasticity. So, generally what happens, you generate new smaller grains from the original grain, we will call it parent grain. So, the new smaller grains, they nucleate at the boundaries of the parent grains through the process of dynamic recrystallization, and therefore, it gives rise a very strong crystallographic preferred orientation or CPO. And otherwise, the microstructures you can think of, these are characterized by twinning, undulose extinctions, subgrains, and the different signatures of dynamic recrystallization. We will see all these things at the end of this lecture, different type or different kinds of microstructures produced by intercrystalline plasticity. And we will see that this flow is non-Newtonian. So, it is strain rate dependent essentially, but strain rate is not linearly dependent on the stress. We will see the equations somewhere in this lecture. So, the very basic idea of intracrystalline plasticity, as we have learned, that it is the movement of the dislocations through the crystal. Now, to define it or to describe it, the simplest way to do that is the Irwins equation. So, Irwins equation is nothing but the basic of most of the intercrystalline models from which the other complex equations or formulations are derived. So, what we see in this slide, we have this yellow grain where this inverted T is a dislocation, and the length of this crystal is L. Now, when the dislocation moves from one end to other end of this grain at the initial stage, let us say this A, at the final stage at B, we see that the grain has deformed. So, the dislocations, the single dislocation move from here to here, giving rise a strain in the crystal. Now, if this is L and then I consider this one is L1, then certainly L1 minus L is the Burger's vector, which is this unit vector of the dislocation movement. So, if we consider this, if we try to theorize it, so deformation of a small region L in a crystal containing a single dislocation with Burger's vector B, and this is what exactly we just talked about. Now, when the movement is complete along this length L, then the strain is Burger's vector divided by the initial length of the crystal. So, therefore, here the strain is essentially this B. So, this is L1 minus L divided by L. So, therefore, this is the strain that we have generated by moving the dislocation from one point to the other end of this crystal. Now, if you consider that the distance is very small, for example, del L of the dislocation movement, then the incremental strain we can consider, or which we can call del epsilon, should be B divided by L, del L by L. Now, we can clearly see that if we replace this 1 by L square, or these two L's, by a term called rho, which we will define as dislocation density, then the equation takes the shape of this, where delta epsilon is equal to rho, which is your dislocation density, Burger's vector, and delta L. These three are multiplied to each other. Now, if we have achieved this little strain through a time of very small delta t, a very small time, then this epsilon dot or strain rate is delta epsilon by delta t. That would give you this form rho B delta L by delta t. Now, delta L by delta t, you can consider this as a velocity. So, finally, we arrive to this equation, strain rate is equal to products of dislocation density, Burger's vector, and this V is the velocity of the dislocations or dislocation velocity. Now, this is a very important equation, and we will see what are the implications of these terms, or how this dislocation density, Burger's vector, and dislocation velocity would influence the strain rate. So, this equation epsilon dot equal to rho B V is the fundamental equation, and it is the rate of deformation is proportional to the amount of unit displacement caused by the dislocation, which is Burger's vector, dislocation density rho, and the average velocity of the dislocation motion, which is V. Now, in this equation, if we consider these three parameters, Burger's vector, dislocation density, and dislocation velocity, we can see that the length of a Burger's vector is nearly independent, because this is an intrinsic property of the crystal. So, it's very much independent, it does not depend on anything of either any physical or chemical conditions. So, deviations are generally observed experimentally less than 10%. The dislocation density at a steady state is a function of the applied stress, and it is independent of pressure and temperature. So, dislocation density is a function of the stress which are being applied. Dislocation velocity, on the other hand, is a very complicated function of stress, temperature, and several other thermomechanical parameters. We will not go into the details of this, but in summary, Burger's vector in this equation is some sort of constant. It is a function of the material or the crystal we are using. Dislocation density rho is a function of the applied stress. Dislocation velocity is a function of the applied stress, temperature, and several other parameters. Now, if we consider all these three, and if we have to achieve a strain in the system, then there is a competition between two processes, that how does a crystal or an aggregate of polycrystals accommodate strain within themselves. Now, this gives rise to two distinct mechanisms. One is work hardening or softening, and another is recovery. We will see what these are in the next slide. So, the flow models, if we talk about, or within the regime of the intercrystalline plasticity, where the crystals are deforming following intercrystalline plasticity, this is a competition, as I talked about, between work hardening and recovery. Now, what is work hardening? Work hardening expresses the fact that more a crystal is deformed, the more it is difficult to deform and require more stress. That means the system that I am deforming through the mechanism of intercrystalline plasticity, it requires more and more stress to deform it. So, if I start deforming it, then it requires more and more stress to continue the deformation. So, if I look at in the form of a stress strain curve, so it simply after the yield, it does not flow this way, you need more and more stress to deform it, and this phenomena we learned is known as hardening or strain hardening. However, recovery is essentially the opposite process of work hardening, which expresses the fact that the stress leading to work hardening can be relieved by thermally activated processes at high temperature, and thus allowing the deformation to go on at constant stress, which is also known as steady state flow. So, that means the stress I need here, this extra stress after the yield, can be compromised if I add some temperature to the system. So, if I add temperature, then instead of following the red curve, after the yield it can flow along a steady state manner. That means you do not need more stress to deform the rock. So, at a constant stress you can continue the deformation. So, the intracrystalline plasticity mechanism, from this slide we can summarize that it is a competition between work hardening and recovery. Whoever wins, the deformation continues or deformation stops, or the crystal or the polycrystals produce fractures. So, how does it work? What is the control, or what are the controls of different types of energies, that how temperature can come and lower the stress level required to deform the crystal? Here is a cartoon diagram where I try to explain the process. So, we know that inside a crystal, if we have a dislocation or multiple dislocations, that means dislocation density is there with some values. So, the individual dislocations, if you remember, the nearby bonds are either stretched or compressed. So, therefore, we have some sort of internal energy within the crystal. So, this is known as sigma internal. So, it can give you a certain amount of stress to deform the crystal. However, if I have this circle here, this blue circle here, if this is an obstacle and a dislocation is moving this way, then it certainly cannot overcome this obstacle and come here to move further, to continue its movement. Now, we know that from here to here, this jump is known as dislocation climb, but where to get this energy? Now, a part of this energy certainly comes from the stress you are applying. So, clearly you need this amount of stress to climb this obstacle. So, this is known as sigma barrier. A part of this stress or energy comes from the deformation or differential stress that is being applied to the system. So, let us assume that it is this much, which we call sigma effective, but we still are left with this much of energy which can come from the temperature or thermal agitation of the system. So, we can see that primarily the crystal has energy within this in the form of dislocations, which we call sigma internal, and then rest of the energy required to climb the obstacles is sigma barrier, and the sigma barrier is achieved by combination of the effective stress and some thermal agitations. So, this is what is written here: to overcome climb and obstacle, additional energy is required. Clearly, bigger the obstacles, you need larger energy. So, the sources of energy to achieve the level of sigma barrier are stress and thermal agitation. And here there are some definitions. Sigma internal is the measure of the stress associated with the presence of dislocations, as I have explained, and sigma effective is the stress to move the dislocations over obstacles without any thermal agitation. At least in this cartoon diagram, we see that sigma effective is not sufficient enough to overcome or to climb the obstacle and continue the motion of the dislocation. Now, in the next slide, we will see some different possibilities where this sigma internal, sigma effective and thermal agitations are competing each other to continue the movement of the dislocation. So, the first one, number A, the thermal agitation is 0. So, therefore, this is your internal energy or sigma internal, and this one is your sigma barrier. So, you have to have your effective stress equal to the sigma barrier, so that individual dislocation can climb this blue obstacle. Now, in B and C, thermal agitation is there. Here this is this much and here this is little higher. But in both cases, the thermal agitation is not high enough or large enough to overcome or to climb the obstacle. So, in this case it needs this much of effective stress, and in this case it also need this much of effective stress. However, in the case of D, this thermal agitation is absolutely fine to climb this obstacle. So, you do not need any stress, you do not need any extra stress required to climb this obstacle. So, what we see here clearly, that if I have higher temperature, then movement of dislocation is much easier, and that can happen at high temperature. So, at higher temperature, the strength or the stress is not required, or you do not need much stress to deform the crystals. And if you remember, in our rheology lecture we learnt about it, that at higher temperature the strength of the material decreases drastically, and now you know the micromechanics why. If you have temperature, then the system gets, the crystals get enough energy to move the dislocations and deform the crystal through the process of intracrystalline plasticity. Now, we will see very briefly the fundamental equations for dislocation glide and dislocation climb. I am not going to show you the derivations, or I also do not ask you to perform the derivations, but if you want, you certainly can do that. There are some books, also online materials. I personally prefer the book of Poirier, so you can check that book and see how the equations are derived. But my aim here is to show, by showing these equations, mostly to explain or to narrate that what are the relations between the strain rate and stress in these equations. So, first the dislocation glide. A dislocation glide happens when dislocations do glide between discrete obstacles. So, that means if I have an obstacle here, if I have an obstacle here, then a dislocation can move from here to here. That means that it does not have enough energy in the system to climb and continue the motion. So, it is restricted between two obstacles, and in that case the larger form of the equation is like this. You do not have to pay too much attention here, but if we shrink the equation or simplify the equation, it takes the form like this. What is important here that we can see, if we simplify it, that strain rate is proportional to sigma with an exponential term, to stress with an exponential term. So, that is known as exponential flow law. So, what are the different parameters here? For example, delta F here is activation energy, R is the Boltzmann constant, sigma effective is the required stress to move the dislocations over obstacles without any thermal agitations and so on. But I repeat, you do not have to pay too much attention in this form, but it is important that you understand this fact that in dislocation glide the strain rate is exponentially related to the stress, and therefore, this is known as exponential flow law. In contrary, dislocation climb happens when the dislocations can climb and at the same time of course glide over obstacles, and these are interstitials and so on. So, what I mean by that, I have one obstacle here, I have one obstacle here, another obstacle here. So, dislocations can actually climb and move and move and move and so on, and then it again can jump and move on. So, it has enough energy to continue the movement of the dislocations. So, it requires, as we have understood, a good amount of temperature. So, it is high enough or thermal agitation to allow the dislocations to climb over small obstacles, and of course, the large obstacles can disappear by climb controlled annihilation. We are not going to explain this term right now, but annihilation is nothing but if we have two differently oriented dislocations, two oppositely oriented dislocations, they can come together and the dislocation can vanish. So, this is known as annihilation. But let us have a look at the equation. Again, you do not have to look at this general form, but what we can see here, here we have all these Burger's vector, this some constant and so on. So, therefore, one can club all these things to a constant, and this we call material constant, and the final equation takes the shape of this. Strain rate is equal to a material constant multiplied by sigma with a stress exponent n e to the power minus q by RT. But again, if we try to see the relationship between strain rate and stress, it comes in this form, and here strain rate is not related to the stress linearly, but it requires an exponent which we call stress exponent. Now, this stress exponent experimentally people found it at this range of dislocation climb, it is generally varies from 2 to 5, it can be much higher, but then we assign it to a different mechanism. So, what we see here, strain rate and stress, they are not linearly related, but it requires an exponent which is n in this case. So, therefore, it is non-Newtonian rheology, as we have learnt at the very beginning, and because it has a power, sigma has a power of n, it is known as power law of flow or dislocation creep equation. So, we see that if we try to compare a dislocation glide and dislocation climb, then dislocation glide is an exponential creep, where strain rate is an exponential function of stress. It happens at relatively low temperature, because if it is high temperature, then it would change to the dislocation climb. Work hardening with progressive deformation, the material becomes harder to deform at constant temperature is a characteristics, because again you do not have enough temperature. So, to do the climb it requires more stress, therefore, work hardening is a characteristics of dislocation glide, and it is microstructurally it is characterized by twinning, kinking, and if you force it, because you are applying work hardening, so you can even produce a fracture. On the other hand, if we look at dislocation climb, it is a power law creep. So, strain rate is related to stress by a power of n. It happens relatively at high temperature, and therefore, recovery is one of the fundamental processes in dislocation climb, where the deformation continues at steady state without fracturing if the temperature is high enough. Now, what we are going to learn, that what are the manifestations of this dislocation glide and climb, what happens to the actual crystal. We learned that at the very beginning, when you are talking about the basics of intercrystalline plasticity, that new grains appear at the grain boundaries of the older grains. So, these are the studies, and so on, the crystals itself modifies and takes a new shape. Unlike the cataclastic deformation, they are not allowed to produce so called fractures within the domain of intercrystalline plasticity. So, we will learn how does it happen, and the process that takes care of the entire grain rearrangement within the domain of intercrystalline plasticity is known as recrystallization. So, recrystallization is a process in response to the added energy. So, these are high temperature and or deformation to the mono or polycrystalline aggregates. So, again it has to happen at high temperature, and you have to have some sort of deformation or not. If you have a deformation, it is something else. If you do not have deformation, it is again something else. So, during recrystallization, the minerals reform their internal arrangements by rearranging the grain boundaries in various ways. We will see those very soon. And why the crystals rearrange their grain boundaries? The essential aim is to stay at the lowest possible energy state. So, if you remember, the defects, dislocations, grain boundaries, etc., are the places where the energy stays, right. So, now if we have to define recrystallization, so what I talked about in these 3 points, these are just some sort of characteristics. But if we have to define recrystallization, it is not very straightforward, because it includes a combination of many processes and also influenced by several other, we will see them. So, in a very general way, if we have to define, we can say that recrystallization is a thermomechanical process where the overall microstructure of rocks is fully or partially rearranged and evolve to a new microstructure. So, I had one type of microstructures, and then I generate to another type of microstructure without producing fracture. If that happens, then I certainly have recrystallized my crystalline system. So, we can classify recrystallization in 2 basic ways. One is static recrystallization and another is dynamic recrystallization. Static recrystallization, if you have to understand, it is very simple. It happens with the only influence of temperature. The process is also known as annealing. That means it makes your grains strain free. So, anneal means making something strain free. In static recrystallization, the grain size generally increases and it is a relatively slow process. The dynamic recrystallization, on the other hand, when you have influences of both temperature and differential stress, that means deformation. In dynamic recrystallization, the grain size generally decreases, but there are some evidences where grain size have increased, and it is a faster process. There is also another subcategory of recrystallization other than static and dynamic recrystallization, and this is known as metadynamic recrystallization. So, after the dynamic recrystallization, if you have static recrystallization, then and then again if the cycle continues, so what happens in between is known as metadynamic recrystallization. We are not going to that part right now. So, these are the characteristics of static recrystallization. As you can see, it is written here, the driving force is provided by the stored deformation energy. So, your sigma internal, that is primarily the large or long range elastic stresses associated with the dislocation and subgrain structures that was formed during plastic straining, and certainly number 2 is the elevated temperature. So, your internal energy and elevated temperature. Primary static recrystallization process, some sort of happens by the formation and motion of new high angle grain boundaries. Static recrystallization typically consists of equiaxed crystals. That means the crystals are mostly of similar size. The microstructure is also characterized by triple junctions, and the grain size is relatively larger, and this is the grain growth is known as competitive grain coarsening. And at the mature state of static recrystallization, the grains are generally strain free. As I talked about, it is annealing, the process is called annealing. So, that is, you do not have any internal energy within the grain. So, you should not see, or very less, undulose extension, twinning and kinking and so on. Interestingly, the mechanical properties, the hardness, yield strength, etc., decreases slowly at the initial stages of static recrystallization, but when the crystals grow in a very large way, then these properties, this mechanical properties, they decrease very rapidly. So, here are some examples I will show you in couple of slides, the statically recrystallized minerals. What we see here in this image is a photomicrograph of dunite from North Carolina. And what we see here, as we talked about, you can see that this is a crossed polarized image. Internally the grains do not show any undulose extinction, the grains are more or less equivalent. You can see also very nice triple junctions, you go wherever you want, you see excellent triple junctions just come. So, these type of microstructures are classically known, or classical characteristics of static recrystallization. However, in this image you may see that the grains are slightly oriented, and this could be the initial deformation that the grains might have at the earlier stage. In the next slide, we have a fine grained marble, where the mineralogy is calcite ground mass of approximately 0.3 millimeter, and it has a patchy recrystallization. So, what we see here, that most of the grains are absolutely strain free. There are few grains like here or here. So, these 3 grains somewhere here, these grains are characterized, and this one, these grains are characterized by twinning. But most of the grains, as you can see again, if I look at this domain, most of the grains are again equiaxed, more or less of equal size. You can also see nice triple junctions, and the grains are strain free, relatively strain free. So, these are the signatures of static recrystallization. However, as we are studying structural geology, we will not pay too much attention on something that did not develop without deformation. So, let us focus on something that could happen with deformation, and this is, we learnt, dynamic recrystallization. So, here again there are some basics, the text is written here. Dynamic recrystallization is the formation and motion of new low and high angle grain boundaries during deformation at elevated temperature. So, you can now guess, as we have discussed, that it requires deformation, temperature, and essentially internal energy of the crystals. So, unlike static recrystallization, you have added deformation to the dynamic recrystallization. At the initial stage of dynamic recrystallization, the grain size slightly increases to a certain deformation threshold, but after that the nucleation occurs and the new grains grow to a typical size, which further modifies with continued deformation, and this is something very interesting for dynamic recrystallization. We will see this with some images. The mechanical parameters, if we think of, then particular elasticity is higher in a dynamically recrystallized polycrystals. And the microstructures are characterized by subgrains, bulging, small grains at the periphery of the larger grains, and of course serrated grain boundaries. Now, we will learn about all these things, the subgrain, bulging, small grains at the periphery of the large grains and serrated grain boundaries in the following slides. We have learned that grain boundaries do move from one place to another place to accommodate the deformation in dynamic recrystallization. So, what drives or what happens during this grain boundary mobility? Here are some points. Atoms along the grain boundary in the crystals with high dislocation density can be displaced to fit to the lattice of the neighborhood crystal with low dislocation density. So, this results movement of grain boundary and growth of crystals of less dislocation density. So, if I have an area of less dislocation density, then this boundary of this area tries to invade into the grains where the dislocation density is higher. The energy required for this, which is internal free energy, increases due to the increase of grain boundary length. You can imagine the fact that I have a fixed area or fixed volume with 10 grains and I have the same area with 50 grains. Certainly the grain boundary areas increases, and if the grain boundary areas increases, then the grain boundary energy also do increase. So, you can ask the question, am I reducing the energy or I am increasing the energy? But the point is that yes, it does, but this is much less than the energy decreased by the removal of the dislocations. So, essentially you bring your energy to a lower level. Now, dynamic recrystallization happens in 3 mechanisms. So, old grains are replaced by new grains, and as I said, it happens by 3 mechanisms. These are bulging, subgrain rotation and grain boundary migration. I must remind you at this stage, these are some basic processes: bulging, subgrain rotation and grain boundary migration. So, these you can consider some sort of the stages of the evolution, 3 basic stages of the evolution, but many things can happen in between, one can influence other greatly. So, let us start with the bulging recrystallization. What do we see here in these 3 illustrations? This is the initial stage, say A, this is the second stage B, and this is the third stage C. These 3 grains G1, G2 and G3 have 3 different shades of grey. The lower shade has the lower dislocation density. So, this one has less than this and this one has less than this dislocation density. Now, as I said that because this has less dislocation density, this grain boundary here would try to move to the places where the dislocation density is higher, and this is exactly what is happening in your figure number B, where we see that a little bulge is happening. So, the grain boundary starts to bulge into the grain with higher dislocation density, and if that continues, then at the grain boundary you end up with some small little grains. These grains are generally strain free. So, if I try to see in a different way a cartoon diagram, so here I have just made 2 grains. So, you can see that these grains are showing some sort of undulose extinction, these 2 grains, or you can say these are subgrain boundaries have already formed, but we clearly see that at the grain boundaries in this cartoon diagram there are few grains, where the bulging has happened. That means these grain boundaries are not smooth anymore. Now, how does it look like when we see a real thin section? Let us have a look here. So, these things generally you see in optical microscopes, but it is better visible if you see them in TEM. So, here are two fantastic images that we can see here. And I think this is the first time in this lecture you are also seeing TM images with some dislocations. So, what you see if I consider this, I will wipe this out later. You see all these thin hair like features within the grains, these are dislocations. Here as well these are dislocations, all these tiny little things, and here all these are also dislocations. But this grain which is in the middle, it has much less dislocation. So, now you can see that a grain with less dislocation density is surrounded by 3 grains with higher dislocation density, and interestingly you see that some sort of bulging has happened here, where this grain with low dislocation density tried to bulge or invade within the grain where dislocation density much higher. The same thing you can see here, this whitish area, it has less dislocation density compared to this area here, and you can see these are trying to engulf or bulge inside the crystals or grains where they have much higher dislocation density. In optical microstructures they look like this. These are some very old but classic optical photographs. On this side you see this is where bulging has just started. The grain boundaries you see, these are not straight anymore, these are some sort of undulated, and the bulging here just has started. This is a Carrara marble, so calcite, and this is a naturally deformed feldspar. What you see here, all these things, this is where the bulging has started in this interface of the 2 crystals. So, if you see a thin section or microstructure, now you will see them in a different way, I believe, and you try to figure out that what kind of recrystallization have happened, and if you see some sort of little notch or little bulge from one grain boundary to another grain boundary, first you must conclude that this is a deformed microstructure, and then you see, then you can also conclude that which grain had higher density, higher dislocation density compared to the other one. The subgrain rotation is the next stage. So, rotation of subgrains in response to the movement of dislocations along low angle subgrain boundary. So, in these 3 illustrations what we try to see, let me mark again here A, B and C. What do we see in A? That these are certainly grain boundaries, these black lines, but these red lines that we see here, these are the orientation of the grains. For example, you can consider that these are the C axis oriented this way. So, as you can see that they are oriented more or less in a very similar way. So, therefore, the grain boundaries here, they are very low angle grain boundaries. Therefore, these are subgrain boundaries. Okay. Now, if the deformation continues, then this subgrain can rotate, and when this grain is rotating, then of course, the crystallographic orientation of this grain also rotated compared to the neighboring grains. So, therefore, you generate some sort of high angle grain boundary with this grain we are concerned with compared to the other grains at its neighborhood. And now, if the rotation continues further, then you have this grain boundary at much higher rotation, high angle with the neighboring grains. So, this is how you form from subgrain to new grains through the process of subgrain rotation. So, these things do happen at the grain boundaries, and if we try to look at that, this is how it has happened in this TEM image. So, for example, this one, the small dislocation free subgrain with slightly curved boundaries, white arrow here, and a larger grain with a low angle grain boundary with twist geometry. So, this one is another. We are not going to go into the details of this twist geometry and so on, but this is certainly a small grain compared to this large grain, as you can see here, this one, this one, this one and this one. So, this grain initially formed probably by bulging, and then it got rotated and you have a new grain, and it is of much smaller size. So, if we try to again look at these in a cartoon diagram, so you have this large grains which are now deformed, and then you have small grains all over along this. These are sub grains, and this got rotated and started forming new grain. The overall this microstructure, when you have a large grain which is surrounded by very small dynamically recrystallized small sub grains, this is known as necklace structure. So, this is the name of this type of microstructure, and also the original grain is known as parent grain, and the new grains are known as daughter grains. Now, this is a fantastic microstructure of subgrain rotation. So, this is a deformed quartz, and you can see this entire quartz grain. It is also not very flat in terms of color, it has also some sort of color variation, therefore, some sort of internal energy, but interestingly you see that the outer rim of this large quartz grain is characterized by many small grains, and these are sub grains. They will continue rotating and then they will form new grains. And if we look at in a different scale, this is a fantastic necklace microstructure. So, these are the large deformed stretched quartz grains, these are parent grains, and all these tiny things decorated at the boundary of the parent grains here, here and so on, these are daughter grains. So, if you see this kind of microstructures, then you clearly can say that this is certainly a deformed rock, and the deformation mechanism going on here is some sort of subgrain rotation. Now, the final one is grain boundary migration. In grain boundary migration, the temperature is very high. So, this is one of the essential parameters. So, the temperature is so high that the grain boundaries become very much mobile. So, you have a subgrain boundary, it can flow in any direction, and therefore, you produce grain boundaries like this amoeboidal shape, or the grain boundary is known as serrated grain boundary. And at the same time, you have the subgrain rotation and formation of new grains and so on, these things to occur. I am not explaining all these things in detail, but trying to give you an idea that how to identify this type of microstructures when you look at your rock under microscope. And particularly if you see this kind of features, at least you can classify or separate out that yes, this is a deformed grain, the grains are deformed by intercrystalline plasticity or the rock as a whole, and these are the stages of the dynamic recrystallization. So, here there is an example. So, you can see this is a feldspar grain, these are again the parent grain, this large grain. So, this entire rock is some sort of anorthosite, this is again a large, but the ground mass, entire ground mass is characterized by number of small dynamically recrystallized crystals, and if you can look at their grain boundaries are highly serrated, mobile, and that must have happened at high temperature. And here is also an example of large equant recrystallized quartz, and what you can see that in few places these grain boundaries are also little random and so on. So, these are the signatures of grain boundary migration here, here and other places. And you can also see some mica grains which are defining a very weak foliation. So, with respect to the stress strain curve, we have seen this illustration before. If we try to see this, that you have your starting microstructure, you start deforming it, you achieve your yield stress somewhere here. So, where you start moving your dislocations inside the crystal. Now, then it requires a significant number of stress hardening, right. So, this is where is your yield strength, and then a hardening is required during the bulging process. But when you start forming subgrain rotation, the new small grains come, the strain softening is the process, and after that it achieves a steady state manner of flow. So, this is how in general you can idealize also that where this is a very general illustrations, the actual curve may be little complicated or different, but this curve is very simple and standard, where at different segments of this curve different kind of dynamic recrystallization do happen within the domain of intracrystalline plasticity. Now, we are done with this lecture with the intracrystalline plasticity. In the next lecture, we will learn about, or we will learn in detail or talk about the mechanisms of diffusion creep and diffusive mass transfer. Thank you.